What's going on, everyone? In today's video, I'll be showing you the complete guide to W58 manual swapping your Lexus SC400. For my swap, I decided to use the XAT Racing Kit. This comes with an adapter plate and everything else you'll need to mount your W58 transmission to your 1UZ engine. Speaking of the W58, I'll be using a 1999 W58 tripod style out of a 1999 Toyota Supra. Now this kit also works with earlier years of the W58. Just note that the earlier years have a direct mount shifter and they don't have the tripod extension, so it'll just change where the shifter comes through in the trans tunnel. And since I'm calling this a complete guide, I think it's important that I also mention there are other routes you can take when W58 swapping. There's two other companies I know of, Quantum Auto and Akita Motorsports. Akita Motorsports makes a bell housing, so instead of using the adapter plate, you just have a bell housing that goes right to the W58 and mates to the 1UZ. Quantum Auto's kit is very similar to this. It uses an adapter plate, and then they have a bunch of options you can choose from to build your own kit. This video will only focus on the XAT Racing Kit, but the installation is very similar with the others. The only thing that's different will be preparation of the W58, but pulling and installing the transmission will be the same. Now let's go over what is going to be provided in the XAT Racing Kit. You're going to get their adapter plate, a T56 style throwout bearing, as well as assorted hardware and seals for the plate and the throwout bearing. Now, aside from the adapter plate and the throwout bearing, you kind of get to build your own kit. For my setup, I chose the OEM cruiser style master cylinder. I believe it's out of a Toyota pickup. I did their lightweight aluminum flywheel. It's around 9 pounds. And then I did their stage 2 clutch. It's not a very heavy clutch. They recommended it to me for a stock UZ setup. And then you also get to pick your clutch feed line and bleed line. I chose 36 inches for both lines, but you can get 48 inches as well. And then I did ARP flywheel bolts, a new pilot bearing, and ARP pressure plate bolts as well. Now, outside of the XAT Racing Kit, there's a few things you're going to have to source on your own. First thing being your pedals. You can get a factory SC400 clutch pedal, but it might be hard to find one, so Excessive Manufacturing makes a pedal kit. You can also pick this up on Drift Motion or on XAT Racing's website. They make a clutch pedal and brake pedal conversion set. You also are going to need a drive shaft. I went with a manual SC400 drive shaft. You could get a custom one-piece made or a custom two-piece, whatever best suits your needs. You're also going to need a few cosmetic things like a rubber boot, a shift bezel, but I'll go over more of the cosmetic things in part 2 of this video after we get the transmission installed. Now that we have everything picked out, let's start prepping our W58 transmission. We're going to start by removing the original throwout bearing and this retaining clip right here. And we're actually going to be removing the entire bell housing because once we put that plate on, we're going to be mounting the 1UZ bell housing to it instead. The bell housing is going to be held on with 9 14mm bolts. They shouldn't be too tight. I used an impact just to speed it up. But yeah, there's going to be 9, and there is one underneath the clutch fork. It's kind of hard to see. I missed it the first time around, so make sure you don't miss that bolt. Once you get the bell housing bolts out, it should come off pretty easy. There's 2 little dowels that it kind of sits on. But as you can see, just with a little shaking back and forth, you could even put a small pry bar in there. You'll be able to get the bell housing off. Now with the bell housing removed, there's going to be 7 12mm bolts holding on this plate. And once the bolts are out, you can just pry this plate off with a screwdriver. There should be a bit of gasket maker or something back there that it might be stuck on. Once the plate is off, you are going to want to scrape off all of this gasket material. You can use a razor blade or wipe it down with alcohol because we are going to be using RTV to make a new seal here. Now we're going to jump on over to the table and we can start setting up the adapter plate. It comes with this little seal that you're going to want to hammer into the back of it. To get this in there, you can use a large socket. I started with this impact socket and it wasn't quite big enough, so I actually ended up switching over to a much bigger socket and using the flat side. And you want to make sure it sits in there nice and flush. And now, as I said before, we're going to be using some black RTV just to make a nice seal around these 2 bearings. Now, before you put the adapter plate on, there is these 2 dowels we talked about. They're kind of going to be in the way from making the plate sit flush, so you're just going to pull these 2 out. You can just do that with a pair of pliers or vice grips or something. And now we're ready to put our plate on. It may take some maneuvering to get it to sit nice and flush, but once you get it on, we're going to be using these 6 provided bolts to screw it down, and you want to do this in a star pattern so you can make sure it mates nice and flat with the transmission. At this point, we can start prepping our throwout bearing. It has these two fittings on here. One is going to be your bleeder, and one is going to be the feed line. And we're going to be replacing those with these two provided fittings that came in the XAT racing kit. Now, the feed side is going to have this pin going through the fitting. You're just going to want to get a punch and hammer that out, but make sure you don't lose it because you're going to want to place it back in there once you get the fittings in. Now you'll notice that the adapter plate has all these pre-made screw holes in it, and that is so you can kind of adjust your throwout bearing and put it wherever works best for you. I don't want to put it straight up and down because that's where our starter is, but they say to keep it above 90 degrees, so I'm just going to angle it to the right just a little bit. Once the throwout bearing is installed and you've chosen the proper location, you can go ahead and screw on your two 36-inch AN lines. The top one is going to be our bleeder, and the bottom one is going to be the feed line. It comes with these extra fittings to screw into your AN line to attach a little bleeder valve on the end. Now at this point, the transmission is ready for your 1UZ bell housing, but I'm actually using the bell housing off of my current transmission, so I won't be putting it on until I pull it out of the car. Once you do that though, you are going to have to drill two holes for these lines to feed through, and I'll go over that when we get to it. So we are now going to be removing the automatic trans from our 1995 SC400. For this process, we're going to start by pulling the exhaust, which is held on down here after the cats with 4 bolts. If your exhaust is anything like mine, these bolts were pretty difficult to get out. I ended up cutting mine, but you could just use a lot of heat. Right now would also be a good time to start draining your automatic transmission fluid. You can let it drain while you move on to the next steps. You're also going to need to remove the automatic trans dipstick. So that's going to be located up here, and it's held on underneath the valve cover with a 14mm bolt. Now you can start removing the drive shaft. It's going to be held on in the rear with 6 17mm bolts, and the same thing up front, 6 more 17mm bolts. And now this is going to be a 2-piece drive shaft, so in the middle you're going to have to pull down the heat shield, and there's going to be 4 bolts holding that in, and then there's going to be 2 15mm bolts, I think, holding that center joint. Now you're going to need to remove the 6 14mm bolts from the torque converter. To do that, there's going to be a little black plate on the front of the transmission held in with 2 12mm bolts. Once you remove those bolts, you're going to want to stick a breaker bar or a ratchet or something on the crank and spin it clockwise, and that's going to give you access to each of the 6 bolts on the flywheel. They're just these tiny 14mm bolts, but once you get those out, your torque converter will be disconnected. And at this point, you can then put a trans jack under. I got this one at Harbor Freight, and then remove the 4 bolts holding in that cross member underneath the transmission. And then there's going to be 10 bolts in total holding this in. You're going to need pretty long extensions to get to the top 3 or 4 bolts. As you can see here, once I pulled it out, those 2 up top are in a pretty tight spot. The top bolts are all going to be 17mm, and then the 4 bolts on the bottom are going to be 14. And now something I didn't know before pulling the trans is that the SC400 actually has a kickdown cable that runs from the throttle body to the driver's side of the transmission. So if you pop off the black plate covering like the throttle cables up top, you're going to be able to disconnect that up there. And then there's just a clip somewhere behind the motor against the firewall that you can slide it out of, and then it'll pull down with the transmission. There's also going to be 4 or 5 plugs. One of them is going to be a speed sensor, and the largest plug is going to be how we're going to get our neutral safety and our reverse lights. The other plugs are essentially useless at this point. So now you can swap over that bell housing with the 6 provided bolts and drill 2 holes for your clutch, feed, and bleed line. You don't need to make them as big as I did. Probably just 1-inch hole would do. Up next, we're going to be identifying the largest plug that was in the transmission. This is where we're going to get our reverse lights and our neutral safety from. I went ahead and pulled the sleeve off so you can see the yellow with the red and black wire is going to be reverse, and the black and white with black is going to be our neutral safety switch. So I extended the wires. The blue is going to go to our switch, and the white is going to be for our reverse lights. So if you notice the XAT Racing pressure plate in the back, that's what we're going to be going over next, our clutch and pressure plate install. Once you get off the old flywheel, which I forgot to record, you're going to want to put in the new pilot bearing that came with your kit, and then you're going to be installing the lightweight aluminum flywheel in my case. And for this, you're actually going to use thread sealant around the threads, not Loctite. And you're going to want to tighten those flywheel bolts to 61 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to be using the alignment tool to put in our stage 2 racing clutch. And once you have the clutch installed, you can then go ahead and align up your pressure plate with that. Now the pressure plate is going to have 6 bolts all around, and you're going to tighten them down to 14 foot-pounds using some blue Loctite just to hold them in there nice and firm. And just like that, your 1UZ now has a stage 2 racing clutch on it, and it's almost ready for the transmission. We're now going to be removing the automatic shift assembly so your new shifter is able to come through. To do this, we need to remove the center console, so you're going to start by popping out the cup holder, and there's going to be 2 screws underneath there. Then you're going to want to pull the shifter back into the neutral position and pull this collar down, and there's going to be 2 more screws underneath of there. Once you get the screws out, the shifter will come right off. You can then pop this bezel out, and there's going to be 3 or 4 plugs under there depending on what trim options your car has. Then there's going to be 4 more screws you got to pop off, and then you'll be able to pull off this plastic shroud. There is 2 more plugs in it right next to your radio. Once you get those out, you'll be able to pull the whole thing off. Once that's off, you can now remove the 4 screws around your radio, and then there's going to be 4 or 5 screws around the shift bezel, and then another 3 underneath the center console. Once you get those out, then there's just 2 more remaining, 1 underneath the steering wheel, and then 1 underneath the glove box. You just got to pop down this little trim piece to access it. Once those are out, though, you can kind of wiggle the whole thing out. If you remove the radio, it's easier. I just went around it. Then there's just going to be 4 bolts and some plugs holding in your shifter assembly. Now, at this point, if you have a direct mount shifter, which I believe is 96 or pre-96 W58s, you're going to need to cut a hole. There's already a dimple for it. It's going to be a little further towards the radio than your factory hole is, but if you have anything after 96, like my 99 W58, you're just going to need to put a little notch towards the radio. That way the shifter will come through. I unfortunately did not know that, so I cut the hole before lifting my transmission, and I did not need to. So learn from my mistake, do your research. If you have a direct mount, you need this hole. If you don't have a direct mount, you do not need to do this. With that being said, you are now ready to lift in your W58 transmission. And if you haven't already done so, it would be a good time to put some red grease around the splines of the input shaft where it goes into the clutch. And since these are from the same generation Toyota, the speed sensor will plug right in. I'll be honest, getting the transmission aligned was a little difficult. Just make sure that your clutch is aligned properly. Make sure you get the bell housing lined up with the dowels on the back of the motor. And then once you kind of get it started, you can put some bolts through and slowly tighten them to kind of close that gap. And if for whatever reason you feel like something isn't aligned properly, I have heard these plastic alignment tools aren't always the greatest. In my experience, it was fine, but if you feel like yours isn't straightened or it looks like it's curved or bent, you can always go on eBay and order a clutch alignment tool for an SC400 or a Supra, and that'll do the job. After that, we can install our manual SC400 drive shaft. You can also get a custom one-piece made if you know the measurements. I just was able to pick one of these up on Facebook. Now that we have our new manual transmission installed with the drive shaft, that is going to be it for part 1 of this series. In part 2, we'll be discussing the manual pedal and master cylinder install, finished wiring, bleeding our clutch system, and then we'll be going over the cosmetics like how to cover up your trans tunnel, where to get a shift bezel, and everything like that. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you're interested, I'm working on part 2 right now. So make sure to subscribe and keep an eye out for the next video.